Last August, when Judith and I were down on the coast of North Carolina visiting my in-laws, my brother-in-law and his wife took us out on their new boat. We set out from a little dock not far from a view of the bridge that crosses the intercoastal waterway, which links the mainland with Emerald Isle. In the middle, the waterway is deep enough to accommodate fairly large craft, but as you move towards the shore on either side of the waterway, even some distance from the land, there are sandbars that are just slightly submerged when the tide is out. This makes for some fun photo ops. So on my phone, I have shots of my wife Judith at a good distance from the land, and 20 feet or so from the boat, arms stretched out, coming towards us looking for all the world like she's literally walking on water. I'm not saying that I hit the relationship jackpot when Judith and I were married, but do any of the rest of you have a spouse that walks on water? You might not want to ask them. Seriously though, as we were taking those photos, I couldn't help but have my mind drawn back to Jesus and Peter and the whole walking on water thing. Then I remembered the joke about the Catholic priest and the Presbyterian minister who took the new rabbi in town out on a fishing trip. They went out to their favorite spot, and the priest got out of the boat and walked some distance, and then he walked back. And then the Presbyterian minister got out of the boat and he walked some distance, and then he came back. And the rabbi, who felt like he had something to prove, and that Christians shouldn't be the only one who get to do this sort of thing, walk on water, got out of the boat on his side and promptly found himself sinking like a stone. Before they reached in to rescue him, the Catholic priest said to the Presbyterian minister, "Do you think we should tell him where the rocks are?" Our understandable Enlightenment tendency when it comes to this particular miracle of Jesus, or some of the others for that matter, is to look for reasonable expectations as to how or explanations as to how he pulled it off. I mean, it ran counter, this miracle did, to all that we understand about the laws of nature. So we can play mental games and say that Jesus stayed atop the waves, well, because maybe he knew where all the rocks and the sandbars were. Of course, given the size of Lake Tiberias, which is several miles across, that's a lot of rocks and sandbars. But our minds work very hard to discount and deny things that don't seem to make sense to us. Perhaps one reason the gospel writers kept this particular miracle story in the mix, which after all was somewhat gratuitous, given that it had nothing to do with healing or helping anyone or even keeping a party going like at the wedding at Cana, maybe part of the reason the gospel writers kept this miracle in the mix is to preserve the idea for the early Christians and for us that God really can make things happen that we think are impossible, even when the tide is high, even when the wind is whipping, even when there are no rocks or sandbars in sight. One value in these miracle stories is that they keep our minds nimble and open to possibility in a world that can often seem overwhelming and even scary. Stories that tell us that Jesus walked on water, and Peter could have too if he'd not taken his focus off of Jesus and instead paid attention to the wind and waves and got scared, weren't and aren't intended to get us to literally walk on water ourselves. Though I will admit that I am intrigued by the notion that Madeline Langell advances in our Lenten study book, that we have forgotten that we were made to do such things as children of God, and that one day she herself might have been able to walk across her beloved dog pond. If you didn't read that in day 2, there's still time. Go back and read it. It's interesting. Madeline Langell believes so much in the power of imagination. being said, there are a whole lot of other things that I have seen human beings do that are more impressive, frankly, than walking on water. The reason the Gospels give for Jesus walking on water are the same as the answer to the age-old question of why the chicken crossed the road. He walks on water to get to the other side of the lake. Like a parent who just wants some time away from the little ones, and he needs a break from being in the boat with the disciples, so he lets them go off on their own. But when the storm gets rough and the winds and waves get high and they are afraid, he cannot bear to leave them to handle it alone. So he comes to them walking on the waves, and seeing him they are terrified because they can't believe it's him. It has to be a ghost, because real live flesh and blood could never be calm enough or transcendent of circumstance enough to walk on water. But there Jesus is. And Peter, bold, impetuous Peter, is the one who says, okay, if it's you, if it's really you, bid me to come to you. Let me walk on water out to you, if it's you, Jesus. And when Jesus does, he gets out of the boat, and he does just fine for the first several steps. It's only when Peter begins to pay more attention to the circumstances around him than to the one who has called him that he begins to sink. Did you get that? It's only when Peter pays more attention to the circumstances around him than to the one who has called him that he begins to sink. The edgy hipster pastor Rob Bell says in a video that we used to show to our confirmation class for years that Peter's problem and the reason that he begins to sink isn't a lack of faith in Jesus. It's a lack of faith in himself as a child of God. He loses confidence in his ability to do what Jesus asked him to do. Now, there's something to be said for that particular take. We can lose confidence in our ability to do what Jesus calls us to do. Communities and individuals of faith do that all the time. We pay so much attention to the winds of culture and the waves of circumstance and challenge that we forget who we are and who we have been called to be and to do. We forget our own identity, our own resources, our own ability to respond. And so I like Rob Bell's approach. But the problem I have with it is that too often, I think especially in a society like ours, which discourages vulnerability and open sharing, too often we can believe that we have to go it on our own. After all, we're children of God. Why can't we just walk on the water? Why can't we just handle the big challenge all by ourselves? Over the Labor Day weekends, Judith and I went down to Asheville for a wedding that she conducted. Weddings can be a little tricky for those of us in recovery, so I made it a priority to go to a few 12-step meetings while I was down there. I'll never forget what I heard a man share at the meeting the morning of the wedding. He said, there are 3 words that I say that whenever I say them lead to trouble. The 3 words are, I've got this. Whenever I say, I've got this, I can be sure that I'll eventually be saying, oh no. He was a little bit more colorful than that, but you get it. What he was trying to say, I think, is that all of us need to know that we're not alone, and we need to act like we're not alone. We need help. Sure, it makes sense from time to time to think to ourselves, I've got this test that's coming up, I've got it, I've studied, I'm ready. This challenge at work that's coming up, I've got it. I'm ready. That's a natural instinct. But there are times, way too many times, saying, I've got this, will lead us into trouble. Because each and every one of us needs the help of God and other people to make it in this world. When we forget that, oh no, it's on the way. We need to be willing to say that we need help from God and from one another. And then we need to reach out for it. That's what helps us to do what can seem to be impossible in life. I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone in my life who has literally walked on water. I've known some people who think they do. But I do know all sorts of people who manage to do something that I consider to be even more impressive than walking on water day in and day out. They transcend their circumstances, and they do it by paying more attention to the love of the one who has called them than to what would cause them to sink. On the cover of the worship folder today, there's a marvelous quote from Madeleine L'Engle in her book, Walking on Water. She quotes a cardinal, Cardinal Suhard, who says, "To be a witness does not consist in engaging in propaganda, nor even in stirring people up, but in being a living mystery. It means to live in such a way that one's life would not make sense if God did not exist." I know people who live like that. I know people who do that. There are people who do things that I consider to be even harder than walking on water. Like aging with grace and dignity, for example. Waking up in the morning and fumbling with the buttons and taking an hour or more just to get dressed. And dealing with frustrations day in and day out, and somehow, more often than not, meeting people with a smile and treating others with grace. That is way more valuable than walking on water. It's a far bigger testimony to the power of God and God's Spirit in a person's life. The only reason people can do that is because they trust in something that's greater than their circumstances. They do it with God's help. They do it by turning to God. What about people who forgive things that really seem to be almost unforgivable? You know, people who have been hurt not just a little bit. That happens to all of us. But people who've been hurt a lot, hurt deeply. And we're not talking about somebody stepping on their toes. I was looking this past week at an old sermon from 2007, or it might have been even earlier than that. Used an illustration of something that had happened just that week. The Amish community in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. Remember that? A guy came into a schoolhouse, shot the door. Somehow the community reached out in forgiveness and grace. It would seem to be impossible for me to forgive something like that if it happened to me or to my loved ones. The ability to forgive something like that does not make sense without the existence of God. What about people who get up each day and somehow move through grief? The loss of something or someone they thought they could never, ever live without. Yet somehow they get up each morning and they step out a little bit each day, and it hurts, but they take a step and then they take another step. Take another step. They're not walking on water. Doing something more amazing than that. They're living into a future that they did not choose. You wonder how they could ever manage that without the help of God. Many of them do it because they trust in God. People who pray and pray and pray and don't get the answer that they want. The answer to their prayer is no, or not yet anyway. And somehow they're able to move forward in acceptance, accepting that it is what it is, for God can work in and through what is. All of these people are doing something more amazing to me than walking on water. They're living in such a way that their life and their actions would not make sense if God didn't exist. Here's another thing. A lot of you in this space